Morning. Welcome. Thank you for being here. The dramatic entrance was insisted upon by the panel, nothing to do with me. It's a delight to be stood up in front of so many faces this morning. The comment has been made that it will be nice to come to Pride Park and not see Derby County lose. But it is probably the background that is important is the demand we've felt from this event is due to the depth of fear and anxiety that the budget created last year. And I think that's probably why there's so many of us in the room today. So delighted you can join us. Delighted to be joined by the expert panel, Carol Waghorn and Gavin O'Neill from Boulers. Most of you will know their faces. Carol, sort of head of pensions and increasingly head of risk and deals with the FCA for her sins. Gavin, head of investments, and we've got an exciting presentation in the second half to sort of talk about where we're going as a business, our next chapter, and the launch of some funds. Also delighted to be joined by Stephen Howe, private client lawyer. I think it's not, he won't be too embarrassed to hear, probably the best private client and trust lawyer I see working in the Midlands, and Craig is okay at tax. So he will help us in that front. What we're here to talk about is the what and the why of the budget and then pick out the headlines that matter to you. The budget was really signposted aggressively before October the 30th. We saw lots of articles leaked, lots of speculation, and it really created a difficult planning environment. Fear and anxiety is not a good place to be making decisions from. And certainly as a business, we saw people either disposing of assets to try and trigger a capital gain before any potential changes. And we were extremely busy with people extracting tax-free lump sums from their pension in fear that that might be an area that they attacked. So not a great place. I didn't think the comms was handled particularly well on the lead up. And then we actually got the budget. And we heard a lot about this black hole, £22 billion black hole. I think the frustration from most people I spoke to was 22 billion is a lot of money, but we pay over £1 trillion a year in tax now. And for argument's sake, train drivers get 10 billion here or whatever it might be. So there seems to be a lot of spending, but also a lot of tax. And the headlines that came out of the budget were capital gains tax up, not perhaps as much as it could have done, but it went up. Business asset disposal relief, lots of you will know that as entrepreneurs relief, changed, reduced. Inheritance tax on pensions, which we're going to spend a good chunk of time on today because it impacts most people in this room. It's the biggest area of change for us as a business, as a pension provider, and probably one of the biggest areas of concern for a lot of the people in this room. Agricultural relief and business property relief, they are, this is what the farmers are upset about. We've got a couple of farmers in the room, but I think it's wider than that. We're going to look at how that matters to those of you that are business owners. Income tax technically unchanged, and that was the nod to the manifesto that said we aren't going to raise taxes. I think it's perhaps a little bit disingenuous to say that this didn't increase taxes for the working people. The NI increase on employers is having a direct impact now on employees, and we're seeing that work through with headlines from the CBI, Morrison, Sainsbury's, other companies cutting jobs in light of these tax changes that haven't even bitten yet. Where we stand today, and a few people have already said to me this morning, it must be a nightmare writing a presentation when it's moving at such pace. And it really is moving at pace. If you'd have asked me 2 weeks ago, gun to my head, I think there was a strong chance that Rachel Reeves might not have been the Chancellor as I stood today. She was under phenomenal pressure as she landed back from her trip to China. Depending on your point of view, she either got good data or she got lucky with some data that week. Inflation was 0.1 down, growth was 0.1 up versus expected outcomes. So there is a huge amount of pressure. We have very little wiggle room as an economy, as our debt is such a big expense. And when the interest rates move, we see that expense tighten, and that creates a very, very difficult environment for a Chancellor who is desperate for growth. Now, the options that they arrive at as we stand now and as we look forward to March, when I think we're probably likely to get another fiscal event of some sort, probably a budget with some changes, do they dare come back and say it's even worse than we thought? We need more tax, and point at Conservatives again and say it's their fault? It's possible, but it would be deeply unpopular. Do they look at spending cuts to give them a bit more wiggle room for the areas they want to focus on? Do they row back and soften some of the changes that were announced in October? And obviously there's a hope, maybe not an expectation, that that might be the direction of travel. Lots of what we're going to talk about today is still awaiting a finance bill to set it in concrete. And all important, can they find the growth they need? We desperately need growth as a nation, and that is where we should be looking to go from here. I actually thought the speech yesterday was pretty good. You know, I listened to her speak at Siemens in Oxfordshire, and the themes of that were fine, in my opinion. We do need to invest in infrastructure. There has been probably a lost decade where we haven't built enough reservoirs, schools, hospitals, rail links, roads, everything that we need as a population that is growing all the time. I'm not sure about Man United needing a stadium. I'm not going to comment on that. But certainly the themes of yesterday's speech were, in my opinion, fine. The problem, the deep-seated problem, is that they are so out of kilter with the sentiment from October. Yesterday's speech says we're going to be the best place in the world to be an entrepreneur. It just mismatches with a tax environment that is so aggressive. You know, that is not what we're feeling on the ground. We are seeing people seriously consider where they want to reside in the world. And that is happening. If you're a young, talented person, particularly working in the city, you know, you look at your options and all of a sudden Dubai with nil tax and sunshine might look a more attractive option. And we are feeling that where people are making that choice. So that's the context. That's the background. What we're here to try and do is articulate the changes that we think matter to you and try to deliver some pragmatic options and possibilities for how we're going to navigate them moving forward. The headlines that we think matter to you are inheritance tax on pensions. We're going to look at that in detail. Capital gains tax changes, which matter for those of you who've got assets outside of those tax-free environments, pensions or ISAs. And then for the business owners in the room and as I say, the farmers that I know are here, changes to the entrepreneurs relief if you're thinking about selling your business, and changes to the business property relief rules that we've lived with since 1993. Inheritance tax on pensions. We have lived with a very, very favourable environment for the last 10, 11 years, realistically, where planning has been perhaps made simple at times. People have been choosing to leave their pension least and last. If you don't need the income, don't take it. It's a good inheritance tax environment. People have had their pensions turned right down. If you need the income, you've been taking it, and that's fine. And the reason that we've got that background to refresh, most of you should be pretty au fait with these rules, is that pensions do currently sit outside of your estate. So they are not part of the inheritance taxable estate. They're their own trust. And that trust benefits from different tax treatments depending on when you pass away. So if that individual passes away pre-75, then 100% of their fund can pass to their beneficiaries without taxation, whether that's income or capital, and it's an extremely favourable environment. Post-75, the same passing of wealth can happen, but when the individuals choose to draw income or capital, they pay income tax at their marginal rate. So it's a notional optional tax for those individuals. So it's been, and it continues to be until April 27, a very favourable environment for your pensions to be able to pass down the generations. Where are we going next? And I'm going to throw over to Carol in a moment to talk about the consultation, which ended on the 22nd of January. Where we're going next is signposted that from April 2027, your pension will form part of your estate. This is the one thing I would have said, I'd have bet my house on them not doing this, because it is the most complicated way that they've arrived at taxing your pensions on death. We've had death benefit taxes in the past. We've had pension law that saw tax payable on death, but it was never part of the estate. They've crowbarred together your will, your estate for probate purposes, with your pension and your pension trustees, which is about the most complicated way they could do it. What happens is that you're going to add your pension to your estate. Your nil rate band and your resident nil rate band, if it applies, will be effectively factored in. And then you're going to get a pro rata amount of tax to pay across your private estate and your pension fund. And that is going to have to be paid notionally within 6 months of death by the pension trustees. So you're crowbarring together your personal representatives or the executors of your estate with your pension trustees. Now, without being too biased, we are a pension trustee company that you can pick up the phone and talk to. That is not always the case. Lots of these pension trustees are faceless, large corporations that are not going to be able to support us a process, I don't think, particularly easily. And importantly, now more than ever, your expression of wish, where your pension fund goes, differentiates the tax treatment on that person. Before, you could leave your fund to anybody and they were treated the same. It was whether you passed away pre or post 75 was what mattered. Now, you do have spousal exemption. So people leaving their pension fund to a spouse doesn't trigger that assessment for inheritance tax. But as soon as you're leaving it to anybody else, it is going to form part of that calculation. So that's one of the signposts we're going to have for you, is to think about where expression of wishes are going and who you choose to favour in that document. Carol, just from your perspective, you've read the consultation paper and the reaction to the consultation period. I suppose the question that's on people's minds are, what's the industry reaction been? And perhaps more optimistically, do you anticipate wholesale changes from that consultation document?
Hope or expectation or anticipation are two different things. The industry has quite forcibly pushed back, I think, in terms of the consultation. And the consultation, interestingly, wasn't a consultation about should we do this? It was more, is what we're proposing to do going to work for people logistically, as opposed to the concept. But the industry has pushed back because logistically, it is very difficult to see that within a 6-month timescale of death, the personal representative dealing with your estate has got to liaise with all of your pension companies who have got to provide values. The personal representative then has to go away, calculate the inheritance tax due, calculate the split between what the inheritance tax is going to be paid by the pension and what's going to be paid by your estate. And then the pension scheme administrators need to pay that inheritance within 6 months. In itself, quite a challenge, I think, as Chris has alluded to, getting that information. And it's quite an increased burden on personal representatives now that are dealing with estates. You know, previously they haven't had to look at pension schemes. So that in itself is quite a big challenge. The timescale, obviously 6 months, is very short, let alone the work involved. And also, at the moment, when trustees are making decisions about death benefits, they have a 2-year period in which to make those decisions. This bringing 6 months into the equation really puts pressure on the trustees to try and make that decision in that timescale. Will they potentially be moving towards moving money to the spouse because there's an IHT exemption there, as opposed to paying money to other beneficiaries that might be more financially in need? So there's pressures there on the trustees. Obviously, the post-75 death is a double taxation event, as Chris has alluded to. You've got inheritance tax being paid and then income tax being paid by your beneficiaries when they're taking money out. So the industry's pushed back on a lot of those, in particular the timescale. And the other thing is liquidity. You know, if your pension is sitting in property, as a lot of them are, where's the money going to come from to pay the inheritance tax in such a short timescale? People have syndicates, so they're not just owning property themselves, they might own it with a lot of other pension arrangements. And so liquidity is a massive factor as well. So thankfully, the industry has pushed back quite hard and basically said, look, this isn't workable. It isn't fair on personal representatives. It's very difficult for trustees. They have suggested a few alternatives. Prior to 2015, we were in a flat death tax rate. That's been suggested. Do we bring back in a flat death tax? Do we look at maybe income tax? So the pension is paying some taxation. And it's a recognition of the fact that obviously the revenue are after tax. This isn't, let's just see if there's any money there to have. They are interested in a tax take here. And obviously the pension scheme is clearly in their focus. So,
yeah, thank you.
we'll see.
Stephen, you've probably dealt with more probates than you care to remember.
I don't want to remember.
Yeah, quite, yeah. From your practical side of things on the will writing and trust writing side that you deal with families, how do you interpret this sort of set of legislation? What do you think people can do maybe to prepare to try and think about this from the executor's personal representative's point of view?
Yeah, so I mean, the way this will work is obviously it makes your probate more difficult, because you're suddenly bringing in another party or several parties, if you've got several pensions, who are going to be involved in the payment of inheritance tax in relation to your estate. But they're also going to be having to share information, coordinate, and you can see, first of all, just even on the information exchange and the calculation of tax, there's going to be issues. And as Carol has alluded to, is the very big problem that's not always thought about, which is how exactly is the inheritance tax supposed to be paid? Because it's supposed to be paid at the end of the 6 months after the month in which you died. And there are serious liquidity issues there. I mean, it's bad enough if you've got to deal with just your free estate, looking for how your beneficiaries will pay your tax, but now this extends to your pensions. So you've got to think, I would say, when you're dealing with your will, you've got to think more than just your will. You've got to think about how my estate is going to work practically. Okay, you're going to have a perfectly finely drafted will and a very, sensible expression of wishes related to your pension. But if your assets and all your affairs are in a mess when you die, you are creating a situation where it's going to be very hard for your executors to administer your estate fast enough. And if you're late, the interest rate is going to be increased from April from just being 2.5% above base to 4% above base. So that will now be, in effect, like having a loan with an 8.75% rate of interest on it. So that's quite crippling. So the thing is you need to do, you need to look at your estate when you're dealing with your will. How is it going to devolve? I think as well, I mean, this hasn't really been said, but it would seem a sensible thing to me. If you have several pensions, you're making your estate administration much more difficult, because every single one of those pension trustees will need to coordinate with your personal representatives. And each of them, as the way they've envisaged it, will be submitting returns and paying tax. So you can imagine how more difficult that is going to be. So if, to the extent I would say that you can consolidate pensions as part of this, that will help. And then all the usual things, I think, become even more important. You must be leaving clear records to your families of things such as, the gifts you made in the 7 years before you died. If you've got business arrangements, you've got to be very clear about how your business is going to pass on. You can't die and leave this as a mess for somebody else. I think, farmers in particular, again, you're going to have trouble because, all these issues we see, when people die and somebody's got a farming partnership and there's an entry in the accounts for property and nobody knows which property it is and things like that. You haven't got time now to sort that out, because you're going to be coordinating not just the inheritance tax on the free estate, but your pensions as well. And everybody needs to be able to pay that liability within effectively 6 months. So you've got a lot of work to do. So it's going to be a lot about organisation. With the pensions, Carol's alluded to, trustees have 2 years from the date of death in order to pay lump sum death benefits. Otherwise, they're going to be subject to an authorised payment charge. You've got to have made that decision before you die. If you leave these questions open, you're making all these advisors' roles much more difficult. It's all going to result in delay, and that's going to result in cost through interest rates. And if your estate is disputed, or you have all sorts of issues with mistresses and things like that, then it's going to become very expensive. So it's going to be much more, I would say, an issue of being very organised. I think most of the clients who sort of we deal with, they're used to this, but that's the sort of thing you need to be thinking about.
I think the very fact that people are in this room today thinking about it
Yeah.
probably puts, the average person in this room way ahead of the curve. But you can imagine people out there who've got no idea where their pensions are, no idea what their will says, and their executors are going to get a real hospital pass.
Yeah.
And that's just something to have in your mind as to how neat and tidy your estate looks and the liquidity.
But the other crucial point to make as well is this we're talking 2027. There are consultations going on about how this will operate. It could be modified. If anybody was around in 2006 when they were proposing the changes to trust taxation, they came in with an initial very penal set of proposals, and then suddenly, quite late in the process, that got watered down to something, more sensible.
Yeah.
So
So we live in hope. But to try to sort of paint a picture of how the examples from the consultation look, we've got a very simple, we've kept it simple, but you can imagine how more complicated this gets over time. So this individual is 81, they've got a £200,000 pension and a £500,000 personal estate that isn't a main residence. They've just got cash, which is again one of the reasons we've picked it, because it's simple. So you're not dealing with the residence nil rate band here, which I'll speak about in a moment. But this person currently, if they pass away, we've got no inheritance tax on their pension fund, and their estate would be £500,000 minus their nil rate band of £325,000 and 40% tax on the residual. So that person's estate is going to be paying tax at £70,000 currently, and the pension fund, because he's passed away over 75, would be left to beneficiaries for them to pay income tax at their marginal rate when they choose to draw it down, but no tax on day one. The change is that you now have to add the two figures together. So we get an estate that's worth £700,000, and you still use the nil rate band. You take the 325 off, but the residual private estate is effectively, we're looking at a total tax liability of £150,000 now instead of 70. What we have to do is proportion that between the two areas. So it's not as simple as saying the pension fund is just going to pay a 40% tax rate. Your overall estate is going to be paying a 40% notional rate on anything above its allowances, but it's got to get apportioned and proportioned between the two areas. So in this scenario, the pension fund is going to pay a tax bill of £42,000 or 21% of its value, something like that. And then beneficiaries will pay income tax. So this is where you see the headlines in the press around the notional 64% tax rate. That is to say, if you have a pension that does get taxed at 40% and the beneficiaries happen to be a 40% taxpayer, the net effect is that you're seeing 64% of the value of the pension wiped out before it gets into the hands of the beneficiaries. It is quite punitive. There is a further tripwire in the consultation. Stephen's quite right, we're hopeful. But as it's drafted, there is a further tripwire if you do have the resident nil rate band. And the resident nil rate band is this extension that came in a few years ago that gave you an uplifted allowance of another £175,000 if you were leaving your main residence to direct descendants. The problem is that that allowance is tapered down if your estate is above £2 million. So at the moment, that's relatively simple to look at. Have we got more than £2 million in our estate? If we have, we're perhaps losing the residence nil rate band. What do we want to do about that? Do we want to gift to get ourselves below £2 million to reinstate that extended allowance? Because a couple can leave £1 million between them, 325 each, 175 each. That's £1 million inheritance tax free currently, but it's tapered down if your estate goes above 2 million. The major headache from this is if you've got a private estate of 1.9 million and a pension fund of £600,000, you're into the realm of losing that residence nil rate band. So it isn't just the taxation on the pension fund that we're talking about up to certainly into the 50s and possibly 60% notional tax for the beneficiaries, you lose the effect of the residence nil rate band, which is as much as 40% tax on £350,000, because those allowances could be lost now with the combination of your two sources of wealth. Real nasty, nasty legislation. We'll try to get more cheerful at some point. Solutions. Try to be pragmatic about this. It is draft legislation. We need the detail, but let's look at what the headline suggests we might be able to do. Affectionately called the Clarkson. Jeremy's been very loud in the press about the farming community and what they might want to be thinking. His answer is a simple one. Wrap yourself in cotton wool for 5 years and hope for the best, and hope that it won't be Labour that is in power. It will be a new chancellor who maybe changes the rules. On the attractive side, it's easy. You know, you don't have to do a great deal. You avoid the potential world of having to take more income out of your pension and pay more income tax. The downside is Jeremy Clarkson is lots of things. He is not necessarily an accurate or reliable political or economic commentator. So I think this is you know, maybe not the best route, but it's certainly what some people will do, hope for the best. The challenge, I think, in a more serious tone, is that any incoming chancellor in 4 or 5 years' time is going to have very little wiggle room. We really do have a welfare bill that is getting out of control, and the tax take has to try and fund that as it stands, unless we get really robust growth. So I don't see any incoming chancellor in 4 or 5 years' time having the freedom to do massive tax giveaways, unless things change, which they do move at pace. The second slightly sort of tongue-in-cheek option is called the Dyson, and that is to leave the country. And, you know, I put this in probably through half a smile, but also a very serious tone, that we are feeling this on the ground. If you are at a certain wealth point, if you have the means to travel the world and choose where you live, then it is a very serious option. I mean, Craig, you're tax specialist, your job is, you know, you kept in a job by these changes, but are you seeing more people seriously consider where they choose to reside in the world?
Yes is the simple answer. And, you know, we're based here in Derby, and you wouldn't have thought 10 years ago we'd have many people talking to us about going non-resident. You get a lot of focus in the press on the non-domicile regime, you know, people coming to the UK from overseas. But I was talking to a client the other day who's has gone down this route and become non-resident. And his point to me was that when he went 18 months ago, there were 5 people in his office, and there are now 35. And the additional 30 are young, clever, bright individuals who've decided to go and do their job from Dubai. Now, you know, Dubai is what it is. It's probably the most popular location we get asked about. And but I think there is a certain age group that will go in that direction. I think as people get older, they find that more difficult because they have grandchildren and put more roots down. And so we tend to find that people ask us that question, but then the practicalities of it mean that they don't do it. But certainly the brain drain is here. You know, people can provide their services from anywhere, and we are a very service-driven economy. So, yeah, and also we've had clients go who have solid businesses here. They can operate that business from overseas by putting a management team in. So this is a big problem. And, you know, I am a big believer that the tax system can be used to drive behaviour. And if you put tax rates up too high, you will drive behaviour. And that behaviour will be, we'll clear off and locate ourselves somewhere else.
From our point of view, you know, it's a drastic option, but it is an option that some people will be seriously considering. You've got to work out where you want to be in the world and if they'll have you. You know, Portugal's changing its golden visa. Spain came out with some drastic headlines a couple of weeks ago about potential 100% tax on Brits buying property there. So I don't think it's an easy one, but it's an option. Onto the more practical and likely solutions that we will be seeing as a business. The first of which is to choose to view your pension through perhaps a different lens to where we've been for the last 10 years or so, which is this is my pension. I'm going to use it first and foremost for income in retirement. It's no longer a great inheritance tax vehicle. So I'm going to turn the income on and I'm going to turn the income up. This is probably a different context depending on your age. You know, people who are in their 50s and 60s can view their pension through this context and say, I'm going to take income for the next 30 or 40 years. And if I look back at 90 and I've had a lot of pension income out and then the kids pay some tax, so be it. It's much harder for those who are in their 80s or 90s who've had their pension turned off for the last 10 years in the hope that it was a good inheritance vehicle. And that is just a sad reality of the way that these rules change. Made even more difficult by the next 2 years, where these rules don't change until April 27. So do I start drawing the income now and start gifting it or spending it? Or do I wait for the next 2 years in the rather macabre hope that I die before the end of the period, which is a backwards way of thinking. But that is how some people will approach this. And so it creates an awful, awful planning environment for the next 2 years. One of the options that I think is useful for you to have in your back pocket and to have in mind is gifts out of surplus income. So most people are aware of the 7-year clock for potentially exempt transfers. If you make large gifts, they sort of tick away over 7 years before they're outside of the estate. Gifts out of surplus income is probably less known, but just as positive as a rule. You can document each year that if you have income of, say, £100,000 and you spend £50,000 on your lifestyle, you can gift the difference without any 7-year clock. So there will be some people that choose to say, I clearly don't need my income because I've not had it turned on for the last 10 years. Anything I turn on now should be able to be evidenced as surplus. Therefore, if I gift it away, I'm not actually exacerbating the estate. I'm getting that out of my estate immediately. So gifts out of surplus income will be a valuable tool for people to use. The downside in this environment is where your income tax rate runs to. You know, if your income from all sources is £30,000 and you choose to take another £20,000 of pension, that's fine. 20%, not that offensive. You should be in a better place than leaving it, for it to be taxed in that aggressive inheritance environment. However, we have a highest rate of income tax of 45%, but a notional highest rate of tax of 60%. If your income goes above £100,000 and you lose your personal allowance, then on the income in that bracket between £100,000 and £125,000, you're paying 60% tax notionally. And that is no fun. And that is no fun for you to consider versus the backdrop of, well, maybe we leave it in the pension and maybe the rules are better in the future. So you've got to consider your income tax position and where that's going to be and then what you do with the money. Spending it is a good option as well. Spending it gets it outside of your estate immediately as well. The flip side to that is the sort of growth and liquidity route. We've spoken about the importance of liquidity and thinking about how a scheme is going to physically pay a tax bill. Those of you that got lots of property, that's an important thing to bear in mind. But some people will choose to go down the route of saying, actually, we don't need the income. We don't want to necessarily pay more income tax. Let's leave the pension fund in growth mode and challenge the pension fund to go and pay its own tax bill. If we fast forward 10 years and we've doubled the scheme in a tax efficient environment, perhaps collecting rent tax free on commercial property, then we have grown the overall fund. Yes, there's a large tax bill for the generation below, but we've done that inside a tax efficient environment without paying tax today. And one of the things that I've heard Craig say with other people is a tax deferred is often a tax saved. If you pay a 40 or a 60% tax today, you've diminished the estate, you've diminished your overall wealth. Whereas if you've grown it and then you pay a 40% tax on day one, well, the residual should still be more. So that is predicated on growth, of course. So practically what you need to be considering is which route are we going to go down? Which strategy works for us in our circumstance? And that's going to be a very individual conversation, a very personal circumstance-driven outcome. But your options are limited. I'd be lying if I said there was a golden bullet to try and sort this out. It's an aggressive tax change. It's a tax change that you need to think about, both from the frustration of the tax that is payable, but also, as we've heard from Carol and Stephen, the absolute practicality of how you're going to leave this for other people to deal with. Assuming you like your beneficiaries and you don't want to leave them a mess. Some people might see the funny side of that, but expression of wishes is essential. Again, after April 27, but when we get there, if you're choosing, lots of people, and some people in this room would choose to say leave half of their pension to their spouse and 25% each to their 2 children, because the control perhaps element, or just wanting to do it that way. Now, those people are going to seriously consider, well, actually, do we leave our pensions to each other so that we are prolonging the potential for inheritance tax? We're pushing it as far away as possible, hoping that one or both of us live a long time and maybe even live long enough to see these rules softened or changed in a more positive direction. So we're in this awful 2-year window, and then it doesn't get much better, but we're in the window where it's very hard to plan, and you've got to be thinking about it. Far easier if you are in that earlier stage of retirement, where the likely shift is, I'm going to look at my pension first and foremost for income now, not least and last. And that's the shift of mindset that we're anticipating. So that's pensions. Capital gains tax, I think there was probably a little bit of political sleight of hand here, or sort of misdirection. We had a lot of speculation on the lead up to the budget. Where's capital gains tax going? Is it going to 40% in line with income tax, 30-odd%? And then we got a 24% headline rate, 20 to 24. And a lot of people have said to me since the budget, well, the budget wasn't that bad, was it? And, but actually, I think that's naive. I think that was probably the intended outcome of this change. Craig, were you expecting capital gains tax to go higher in the budget? And I think one of the questions we've had is, do you expect them to maybe come back here for more, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, my prediction at the time was 30%. For the historians, tax historians in the room, we used to have a system of what was called indexation allowance. We used to have very high rates of headline rate of CGT, but then it was reduced by either a tapering system, depending on how long you held the asset, or and you also got the benefit of an inflationary increase. So I think it might have been George Osborne that introduced the flat 20% and abolished inflation as a relief and tapering. So the reason CGT is a lower rate than the normal income tax rates is precisely because you shouldn't really be paying tax on inflationary gains. I don't think they'll come back again at the moment. I think Chris is going to talk about business asset disposal relief. So, yeah, I think it's a reasonably safe position as it stands. And maybe some of the politicians have a self-interest in that, maybe. Yeah. I don't know. But we'll see.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, capital gains tax is one of those environments where it's a tax you're only paying if you've made a profit. So that's the sort of nice feel to it, I guess, if you look at it through that lens. Allowances are very, very low now at £3,000 per annum per person. You do have the potential to flip assets between spouses, potentially to use both allowances. And so there are the age-old sort of planning routes that you can go down with CGT. I think probably they didn't go further with this because of the amount of activity we saw before the budget. We saw huge amounts of disposals. This isn't, I don't know this man, but it was in the public domain. The chap who owns Dunelm sold £180 million worth of shares a matter of weeks before the budget to trigger a capital gain at hopefully the lower rate. And I suppose he saved himself 4%. It wasn't maybe as far as he thought it was going to go. Limited sort of solutions here because of the fact that it's a tax that's payable. One, it isn't payable on death, and that's stayed. So if you've got a buy-to-let property that stands at a huge gain, then you might choose to just hold that all the way through and distribute it as part of your estate, rather than thinking about trying to move it around or gift it or even sell it to use that exemption on death. So there is that flexibility. Gavin is going to take the mantle in the second half, in the second presentation a bit later on, where he's going to talk about our new fund. The new fund has been launched from a number of different perspectives. We think it's the next chapter of our business in lots of ways. Ability to drive charges lower through economies of scale, and a few other things that Gavin's going to highlight at the second half. But one of the wins is that because of the way we're structuring this, we can trade within our new funds without triggering a capital gain. So the only time a capital gain would be raised is when somebody chooses to say, I want some money back out. So it gives us an extra flexibility and an extra functionality inside an environment where capital gains tax allowances used to be £12,000 each, and it's now £3,000 each. So just the natural buying and selling of funds that we want to do to keep the investment performance sharp and on the button, that could be triggering gains inside taxable funds, whereas our new fund won't have that same challenge because we can make choices. Gavin can, react to a Donald Trump tweet or whatever he does day to day. We can do that within the fund without triggering a capital gain. So there is a, for those of you who've got investment funds outside of pensions, outside of ISAs, that's going to be something that we're going to be talking to you about. Entrepreneurs Relief, as it was known to most people in the world, in the room, lots of you will remember when it was £10 million at 10%. It's been slashed down to £1 million at 10%, and it's broadly being phased out now. So we are seeing, if you sell your business before April this year, you can have 10% tax on the first million. After April, that becomes 14% tax. And if you wait until April 2026, then that's going to be 18% on the first million. This is what I allude to when we say we are trying to be the most attractive place in the world for entrepreneurs to grow businesses, take risk, be innovative. And we have a tax system that is going in the exact opposite direction. We are disincentivizing that. The government and the Chancellor would point to business heads that they seem to get cozy with who have said, it wouldn't have stopped me launching my business, wouldn't have stopped me creating my business. These are now many, many multimillionaires or billionaires. They're looking back through a lens of, I would have taken that risk. We're talking here about more the practical side of, am I going to set up I've been employed in a garage, am I going to go and choose to set up on my own? It's that practical side, not the people that become, the major headline names. This is real businesses on the ground that's being disincentivized, in my opinion. So it's a negative change. What we are seeing is certain people who've got that management buyout potential. If you've got the management team below you, do you look at that seriously and do you accelerate your timeline? It's a little bit, could be tax tail wagging the dog, but if you're in the realm of saying we were going to sell the business to the main couple of employees next year, well, maybe you paper that deal today and do it, if you can, before April the 5th and save yourself £40,000 worth of tax. And if that's a couple who can both use their £1 million allowance, that's £80,000 worth of tax purely for doing a deal before April instead of after April. And it more than covers the professional fees in that scenario. Deferred part of that deferred consideration is a concept that we're familiar with as a business and lots are. You can paper that deal with your management team without the cash having to necessarily move hands. So if it's the sort of thing that is attractive to people, you can say, right, let's transfer the shares, let's lock into the price, lock into the capital gain today, but the actual buyout is going to take 5 years, 6 years, whatever it might need for that cash to transfer. So there are some options there, and again, it needs thought, it needs planning. Employee ownership trust, I've put that in because it's a very it's a hot topic in our world. It's probably a popular subject in some ways and maybe a little bit unknown on the ground. Again, this is for the business owners who are looking to dispose of their business. One of the routes is employee ownership trust. Craig, you've advised on a number of these. Do you want to just give the headlines for the room as to what that means in practice?
Yeah, this is a sort of the concept that using the tax system favourably to try and encourage people to sell their businesses to the employee group en masse. So an MBO typically will be targeted to a number of key management, or even if it's a family MBO, the next generation of children who might be working in the business. An EOT is a sale to the employee group. It's zero capital gains tax, and typically it's funded from either spare cash in the business or future profits. So it can be a self-funding exercise. And for some clients who haven't got an obvious exit through a trade sale or management buyout, that it can be attractive. We've done quite a few now, and the takeaway I come from with it is it's got to be culturally right for that business. Also, otherwise you get into some challenges fairly quickly. That said, the rules have been tightened. I thought this might go in the budget, but the rules have been tightened. There's been some abuse, I think, around valuation, as you might expect. Some people have overvalued their businesses on the basis of a huge tax-free gain. So the rules have now tightened relating to valuation. And there's also a longer tail. So one of the trade-offs of a tax-free disposal is that you have to fit into certain rules now for about 4 tax years. And that can be difficult. So, yeah, we have a lot of conversations about EOTs, very happy to talk about it and share some of the, we tend to be very much on the conservative side of this, make sure it fits the business rather than just being a tax-free disposal. Those two things have got to be married together.
But I think it goes back to a point Craig made earlier about the tax system impacting on behaviour and changing people's mindsets. You know, if the tax rate goes too high, people do get creative with their planning. And that might be choosing to dispose of their business whilst they're on a beach in Dubai for 5 years, because the amount that they're going to save versus 24% tax on the profit is going to more than cover their costs of rent or buying or whatever they need to be a resident in a different country for that period of time. So again, going back to the context of today, the mismatch between this story of growth and the story of where we want to go to with this budget for growth versus the real lived experience of a tax regime that is cultivating people. It's like the straw that broke the camel's back. It was, 20% tax. I can swallow that on the sale of my business. 24%. It's like a psychological sort of barrier that just seems to have tripped, where people are now feeling very, very disenchanted. And it probably goes hand in hand with, lots of things that we can't blame Rachel Reeves for, but the fact that the roads are worse than they were 10 years ago. School places are harder to get than they were 10 years ago. The NHS is fundamentally broken in lots of ways. So there's a little bit of a combination of, we don't feel like our tax money is being spent very well, and the amount that it's going up is increasing aggressively. So another area for consideration is that of business property relief. We've had business property relief on trading companies since 1992 or 3. And we were talking before the presentation, planning over the last 10 years has been really, in lots of ways, quite simple. If you've got a trading company and a pension, you could pretty much think of them in their own silos and say, they're both exempt from inheritance tax, don't need to worry too much about them unless I choose to sell my business, and then I've got a load of cash to deal with and make a plan for. So you had this sort of this compartmentalized view of the business is fine, inheritance tax free, the pension is inheritance tax free, it's just my house and my personal assets that I've got to really get a good plan for. Now, as Stephen alluded to a little while ago, everything has to be thought about through a collective view, a collective plan, liquidity, strategy, and a really clear and concise method for how you're going to distribute these assets, either during your lifetime or when you're not here. And what that means and what the change is, that the effective relief on trading companies has been cut in half. So the notional tax rate becomes 20% on anything above £1 million. And £1 million isn't what it used to be. To have a business that's valued over £1 million, it's not that uncommon. There will be a lot of people in this room with a business that may not have any more, but certainly would have been worth lots more than that. And if we think about this in practical terms, how many of those businesses today have got hundreds of thousands of pounds sat to one side that they could lose in the event of a senior shareholder passing away in an untimely manner? And I think one of the points that Craig, Stephen and I have been speaking about on this subject is who actually the tax falls upon. So I'm probably catching you a bit cold on this one, Craig, because I forgot to sort of signpost this one, but you just speak a little bit around how the tax implications could work for a beneficiary via will versus the company.
So what I'm sort of describing this, people need to get the corporate house in order effectively, treat it like your own estate, because suddenly there's going to be a tax bill now, and that tax bill. So I'll give a very simple example. Let's say you've got shares in a trading company and they're worth, I don't know, £2 million. And in your will, they get passed to your children because previously they would have had business property relief in full. And suddenly now there's a tax charge on those shares. The tax liability rests with the estate. So of course, if somebody says, well, how do I turn my £2 million worth of shares into cash? And nobody's done anything to plan for that. The company can't afford to buy them back. The continuing shareholders refuse to buy them back. And let's say you've then left the remaining cash in your estate to your spouse. Well, that tax bill is coming out of your spouse's, unless you choose to pay it off over 10 years, of course. But that's the point. The shares can go in one direction and the liability can end up in the other direction. And so therefore, you really, really got to think, what you've got to take away from this is that you need to think about two things. One, how am I going to realise the value of these shares on my death? Because there's now going to be a tax liability attaching to them. And secondly, how on earth am I going to fund this tax if those shares can't be realised? And Chris is coming on to talk about insurance, but it will be a big player and a necessary player in this industry.
Yeah, please, Stephen. Yeah.
I think the other thing is it's very important with your talking about your will and you've got an interest in a business or even agricultural property relief.
Sorry, Stephen, just a touch louder for the room.
Sorry,
Yeah.
the way this works is it's £1 million per person, and that £1 million does not, like with something like the nil rate band, accrue to the survivor. So each of you has to use it. And if, say, you've got a husband and wife, and the person on the first death leaves their business property to the survivor, you're only going to use that 1 million once. So you need to be very careful to make sure that you're using the first deceased 1 million by directing it other than towards the surviving spouse directly. And then you can use it again on the second death as well. And the other thing I think is very important with wills in particular, it's like Craig says, if you have provision in your will just says, I leave my business, my shares, my farm to X, and it's unqualified because you were thinking it'll be 100% relief, not a problem, you've got an issue there because you'll trigger a tax charge on the first death. All right, you'll potentially. Better thing to do is always to have it, the gift related to a formula, which says basically I can give as much of my business property as I can without triggering a tax charge effectively on the first death. Make the gift as big as you can, and then anything else will pass in some way, shape or form to the survivor. So you defer, so you use the business property as much as you can and defer the remaining bill to the second death. And you always want to do that because it gives the survivor and the family then time to deal with that. Okay, you don't tend to want to trigger tax charges early because you can't do anything then.
So one of the things I've been saying to clients, and this is a genuine frustration, we're probably one of the industries, certainly Craig, Stephen and I, from our business perspective, we're probably net benefactors from this budget. We are busy, the demand for our service is going up, but we don't make anything. We push bits of paper around and try and add a lot of value to your world, but it's not inherently a growth industry where we're going to go and drive the next technology company or anything like that. So this budget has probably meant that everybody's will in this room needs some thought at least and possibly revision. So it's created a lot of activity, but not necessarily activity that drives, those new schools and new roads and businesses that can employ people to really make our economy grow in the truest sense. So it's a bit challenging at times. But one of the solutions that we can look at is for those people who've got trading companies, there is a window before April 26 where you could consider gifting a large portion of that trading company into a trust. Craig, just want to highlight how that works in practice from the conversations we've had with people?
Yeah, very briefly. At the moment, we've still got 100% business property relief on shares in trading companies. So it's worth just understanding if your company is a trading company, just if you've got mixed assets in there, in investments and so on. But broadly, you could place those shares into a trust for, say, your children, and you can claim 100% relief. After the 6th of April 26, you will only be able to claim 50% relief. So there would be broadly a 10% lifetime tax cost to putting shares into a trust. After that time, the first million would be tax-free. Anything above that is at 10%. So obviously you don't want, there are some anti-forestalling rules if you were to die within 7 years. And again, I would suggest thinking about some insurance to cover that eventuality, but probably too much for this room in terms of detail. But yeah, the conversations we're having right now and we'll continue to have for the next year will be, is it the right time to pass on big chunks of shares and survive 7 years?
A word on that, it was maybe not relevant to lots of people, but those of you that have chosen to look at the AIM market for some inheritance tax efficiency, we've seen a reduction there in the allowance that is allowed. So technically under the same sort of regime of business property relief, but you could have an exemption for investing into the alternative investment market. See the names like Majestic Wine, Fever Tree Tonic, they choose to list on this UK smaller company market, and you can have a relief for holding those shares after 2 years. That relief has been cut in half so that now the effective relief is 20% rather than the full 40%. The market has been subdued, I think it's fair to say. Some of that is on the lead up to the budget and the fear that that relief could have been changed as it was and could have been removed entirely. The market did bounce a little bit on the day of the budget, 3 or 4% across the index, as it wasn't as bad as it could have been, I think, in some ways. But it's been subdued for a longer period than that, in truth, through a little bit of anti-UK sentiment. We could do with a stable political landscape for a while. We could do with some incentives for UK smaller companies to list on our market. You know, the tech and the biomedical companies that are innovative in this country, lots of them are choosing to list on the US stock exchange because it's perhaps attitude. There is a bit more free capital over there and maybe a bit more of an incentive for those people to go and do that. So that for people who've got the AIM shares, there's a decision to be made there around whether 20% relief is better than nothing or not, as it were. Craig's alluded to protection a number of times, and I think he's quite right to do so, predicated entirely on your own personal circumstances, but the demand for insurance or protection is going through the roof. It really is. We're seeing, if you're a trading business and you've got that context that we've just spoken around, where the value of that company could create a large inheritance tax bill without necessarily having the cash to cater for it, then does the business choose to go and fund a premium to pay that sort of liability in the event of someone passing away in an untimely manner? Beyond that, if you are going to make large gifts with a 7-year clock attached to them, do you choose to insure that 7-year window? Do you choose to take some gift into Vivus cover? Or beyond that, if you've got a large inheritance tax liability and you don't want to make large gifts, you just don't think it's the right thing to do because of perhaps where the generation below are with their marital status or whatever it might be, then you can insure the liability either for a period of time or for the whole of your life. But lots of this conversation ends up being driven by the premiums. We're delighted to have refreshed and relaunched our protection solution. We've coupled with a firm in London who it's all they do. All they do is broke life cover. And so the way that this is working in practice is that we're going to work with you to establish potential needs, potential liabilities, and the cover that you might want to look at, and then introduce a company called JLHO to actually broke the best type of cover. And I could go into a lot of detail about why and how that's better than previous ways. It's not for today, but certainly when you're having your meetings with your consultants and financial planners, you know, we've got a solution that we think is going to push us on versus lots of our competitors. So I'm keen to leave a few minutes for questions to the room. We've had some in advance. In summary from me, an aggressive budget. I think probably misunderstood, underestimated by the mainstream media and most people on the street. I don't think people have woken up to, in particular, the aggression of the inheritance tax on pensions. You know, that captures a huge amount of people who would not even consider themselves truly wealthy. They wouldn't think of that, but they're now caught by hundreds of thousands of pounds of additional tax liability that they didn't face, or from April 27 they will face. So quite aggressive, out of kilter with growth. You know, it's just not true to say that that was a growth budget. I think yesterday's speech was pretty good for growth, but it's just out of kilter and it's undermined by those tax changes we've looked at today. Your wills and your estate and your planning almost certainly needs looking at, even if it's purely to make the processes more simple. It might not be all about saving tax. It might be about avoiding a near 9% interest charge if your estate takes a long time to organise. You know, getting your house in order in that 6-month window is going to be valuable to the beneficiaries, even if you don't choose to put structures in place to really mitigate the tax liability. So consider insurance, consider your plans, get organised, but I think most of all, make sure you're talking to your professionals. Obviously, we're here to help. We want to be here for you all to talk you through these challenges. And then there are, you know, the people that write your will, the people that undertake your specific tax planning. And, you know, we want to work with those other professionals, because you cannot really anymore compartmentalise your wealth into pockets and silos that don't interact. They all interact now. And there will be a lot of people who get this right, and there will be even more people who get this wrong. And I think the fact that you're here today thinking about it is excellent. And then it doesn't go away. I think it's going to need to keep being on your agenda to review, discuss, adapt and amend as the rules settle down. And I would caveat all of this, as Stephen did quite rightly early on, we are just at the end of the consultation on inheritance tax on pensions. We live in hope. They may have to row back. But I think probably most people are cynical like me, that I think we need to brace ourselves to try and react to these quite punitive changes that we're seeing and we've talked through. Got a chap over here.
Trusts and 10-year tax charge. As I understand it, a trust that might not have any tax might have otherwise exempt property, previously exempt property shares in a trading company, land, whatever. When the 10-year tax charge next falls, if that's just after April 20 whatever, it's not apportioned. You'll get the whole 6% tax charge, even though for most of that 10 years, the assets would have been exempt.
I'm getting.
Right in that.
I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I think you wait for the legislation. There's nothing published yet, but so you'd have to see, and then there will be a difference in treatment between trusts that were created and funded before the budget and those afterwards. So, but we await the details basically. But I
So
think,
should one be planning the liquidity issue?
well, I think you've got to wait for.
The tax charge in the trust that's got no cash at the moment.
Well, you've got to, yes. I mean, that's right. You've got to think about how you're going to pay your tax charge, because you're going to have exactly the same issue. Otherwise, if you have an estate, you'd have an unpaid tax bill and need close to 9% interest. So,
I mean,
yes.
I suppose the precedent would be a company that's lost trading status within the 10-year window, and
or you've
at the
sold a
moment-
bit, or sold shares in a that was otherwise qualifying business and
Yeah.
you're in non-qualifying.
which
assets.
today would be the full 6%, wouldn't it? That's not proportioned or prorated over the period, is it? Good question, Tim. I think it's very niche to the room, but yeah, it sounds like you need to prepare for liquidity. I think.
I think we're still not clear either where the £1 million fits into that BPR limit. So if you've got shares in a trust, I mean, clearly it's going to be a worse position than you've currently got. And the challenge with trusts is exactly that.
Just also bear in mind as well, if you've still got qualifying BPR assets, the rate of tax is half, so it's 3%, not 6%.
Yeah, still 3% if you've got no money.
It's 3% if you've got no money, or 1% if you've got no money is a bit of a pain as well.
Yeah.
And at the moment, you can pay that off over 10 years with no money, obviously. But there you go.
Okay. I think there's a question here.
The recipient of a gift from excess income, do they have to declare for income tax purposes?
No, that's no, it's just a gift that is either gifted out of surplus income or potentially exempt transfer. And that's where there's a form that I allude to with clients that you can sort of do your homework in advance here a little bit, which is called the IHT 403 form, which gives you the framework of this is my income, these are my sources of expenditure, what counts towards that and doesn't count towards that. And the recipient has just received cash. It's not income taxable in their hands. It's just a gift.
The point I would just add to that is that if you Google it, it's not as easy as just making one gift and then forgetting about it. There has to be an established pattern. You've got to keep very good records. So yeah, you can find, obviously people are happy to give advice, but there is some very good guidance on this on, like the gov.gov website on what type of thing you have to do. So yeah.
It's a
Follow
very common question when I'm thinking about gifting money to children. Lots of people say, are they going to get taxed on it? Well, the answer is sort of no, not today, but maybe, depending on your estate, whether it's a 7-year clock or a gift out of surplus income or within your allowances. So it needs thought, but they don't have to think about their self-assessment and declaring it or worrying about tax in the year they receive it.
We often tell people to keep a pet register, and I don't mean cats and dogs. I mean actual gifts that you've made and in that period, and those which are outside of, or you consider are outside of the normal 7-year rule due to being out of surplus income.
Tony, we've probably got time for a couple more questions, Tony.
Is it on? Yeah, it isn't.
You're on.
So let's say you're going to gift your children. It's mainly children, isn't it? You give money to. Let's say you're going to book around the world cruise for £25,000, and alongside that, you're still gifting your kids £1,500 a month. Say, how's that? Because you're taking it out of your savings. How would that be looked at?
That's a good question. Are you taking it out of capital, or is it coming out of your income?
Capital.
Yeah. Well, you might have to have an argument about that if it was challenged.
I bet they'd win.
Yeah.
Are you asking about whether you invite your children on that voyage as well? Is that part of it?
No, I'm going on the cruise to get away from them.
Sort of influence who goes.
Good stuff. Michelle?
Hi, you've probably covered this, but I just wanted to be clear with regard to pensions and the inheritance tax potential. Is there going to be a difference between proactively drawing on your pension and building it up for inheritance tax, or previously for inheritance tax benefits? Will there be a defined division against those who actually need that money and they're drawing it regularly, and it's obviously clear from the records that they're doing that, as opposed to those who are just building and building and building, clearly storing it?
No, sadly not. I mean, what Michelle sort of alludes to, in the past, there was a differential treatment between those who had crystallised funds and those who had uncrystallised funds, which is this sort of jargon we use for people who've accessed their pension, taken a tax-free lump sum, and those who haven't. But no, there's no differential treatment now. If you have a pension fund on your death, it's going to form part of your estate. No matter what you've been doing, if you've been drawing your income or leaving it in growth mode, the treatment is the same. So we've got just time for one last one, and then we'll wrap up for a comfort break.
Do you think there's any likelihood that she'll diminish the 7-year rule or increase it?
Again, it was one of the threads that got speculated about on the lead up to the budget. There was an article that seemed to get sort of some traction that said it could go to a 10-year clock instead of a 7-year clock. I don't think it's enough of a core area for them to come back and tinker with at this moment in time. Craig, anything different to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there was some talk a while ago of, 10 years, they could shift it. Whether they do or don't, we just don't know. There was some talk a while back about gift taxation. So, the 7 year, if you give some money to your children, maybe there's a 20% tax charge against that. We've not seen any evidence of that. So it would just be speculation. But of course, anything can happen.
Okay, so thank you for all your diligent attention. I'm conscious it's been a difficult subject at times and not necessarily most cheerful. Thank you. A round of applause for the panel would be appreciated.